again and then mute everybody.
Okay.
Okay, Kim, can you unmute yourself? You're still muted.
It should do it.
Yep, okay, great.
All right. Well, here we go. So oops, that's not. Well, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. Here we are. The first slide, the only difference between the first slide last week and this one is the date. So it's again the overview, the sort of the chart map on the left of the Great Salt Pond, also known to me and many as the New Harbor. And then on the right, also the Great Salt Pond, as you could be seen in the summer, with a lot of boats. But we'll go to our maps, our more pertinent maps, even though they're old. Again, on the left map shows, I've outlined it sort of blue, the area that we're going to be covering, and it's from where we stopped last week here at Harris Point, and we're going to be ending here at the sort of the tip of Indian Head Neck. Now, what's really cool to see in this particular map is this, again, this is a late 1800s map, is what I refer to as the Stonewall map, is that it shows this road, this town road that comes by the end of Payne's Dock and then goes over a causeway up to a road that runs along Indian Head Neck. So it's called Indian Neck Road, and goes all the way up and ends at, well, the end of the lane, which I'll explain a little bit further. But so it goes right along this edge, and this was all pretty much mostly all used for horse-drawn trolleys, but it was an actual road. There was a causeway across what is now the channel and town road, and that's why we have our boat launching ramp that's owned by the town right here. So you'll see that more in current photos, but I just wanted to show you that this was an ancient road. We'll probably be walking along this road because I imagine much of this is been eroded away. So I don't think you could actually find this road on the map on the ground anymore. But this is the general sort of topographical area, Indian Head Neck. So we go from the beach here, which is very low, almost sea level, maybe 5 feet above sea level, 7 feet. I think the road is the Cornneckers Road is 7 feet above sea level, to this more elongated headland, which is known as a drumlin, which is a geologic feature of deposited materials. So that's a little background about this particular area, but of course we'll be traveling on the edge. So this is where we left off last week, at the tip of Harris Point, looking easterly. And as first thing you do when you come around that next corner, is you find this wonderful driftwood sculpture. That seems to be a popular pastime around Block Island. I'd never actually noticed one in the New Harbor or the Great Salt Pond. Usually you see them on the ocean side, but there it is, and I find them quite beautiful and fun to look at and to think about the people who are having fun making them. But we'll keep going, and as we go along this edge, it's a mix of sort of sand and grasses and different vegetation types. We're still looking easterly, and Harris Point would be back here way to our left, and it's a little bit of land that runs, and Cornneck Road is right about here. So we're going along this edge towards what many people know as Mosquito Beach. You see this little line of rocks here, and then you see it up here in this photo. And those were definitely put there in earlier times. A lot has gone to shore up this area, because now there's actually a road up here, which we'll be seeing. But before we get there, among that little line of rocks was Willet, there was a willet, of which I have 3 photos, so it's not 3 individuals, but it's a beautiful large sandpiper type bird, does nest on Block Island. And this one was not nesting, was basically feeding. It's very similar in look to a yellow legs, but greater yellow legs has, guess what, yellow legs. So these have more of a grayish, bluish gray legs. And but beautiful scalloping on its plumage, and a fun bird to see. When it's in flight, it has a really distinctive black and white sort of marking to its wings. So as we go along, we get to a point where I decided that I would leave the edge of the water, but you can continue to go on the edge of the water, which you should do if you're walking this stretch. But I clambered up these rocks because and you can see them here, because I know that there is a road up here. So this road is the road that goes from Corn Neck Road out to Harris Point, and it is a private road. So I just wanted to show you that it was there. But what's very interesting about it is in the early maps, you can see that there's quite a marshland on the other side of it that runs quite a distance. And so that's why they had to build up the road and shore it up, because this normally in past days would have been a marshland leading right into this area of the beach, but now it's sort of they're separated by this by the road. But if you look back into that marshland, you can see quite a beautiful marsh. It is mostly freshwater. You can see when you're walking on the harbor side of the beach, you can see fresh water draining out of this all the time. And it's a wonderful place for egrets. And in the back corner, right back here, you can see there was a pair of snowy egrets feeding back there. Quite a beautiful bird. We have 2 egret type snowy egrets and great egrets. Snowy egrets have black bills, and their feet, although just barely coming out, are yellow. So even though its legs are black, its feet are yellow, and it has a black bill. And it's a little bit smaller than the great egret, but just as elegant and beautiful. So if we go along, we get to the point where we're really looking onto what is called the Mosquito Beach here. And behind it is the marsh. So this marsh here, I've just walked down the road a little bit and looked at this area back here. So it's, again, a very interesting ecosystem, a lot of wetland plants, sort of a salt marsh. And it's one of the few where it has been ditched a little bit on both sides of the boardwalk, which I'll show you shortly. And that is for something called open water management for the control of mosquitoes, but more on that later. But along that road, just before I went down back onto the beach, a couple of common summertime flowers that are just started to bloom in the last week, and chicory on the left, also known as ragged sailor, and common elderberry on the right. And these particular elderberry, these are still in buds. There's a few flowers, but mostly these are the buds. And but on the same tree, you could have a whole umbel, a whole sort of head of flowers that are actually in bloom. So they're actually they bloom very quickly. They're already starting to go by and set their fruit for elderberry. So I kind of jumped around a little bit. I finished up at that edge where it connects to the Great Salt Pond, to the Corn Neck Road. And then I've walked back to the Mosquito Beach entry point into the new harbor. And just to show that there is a entry point that you can get to with a boardwalk. This is town-owned land. The town built this boardwalk a number of years ago. And the kiosk is one of several around the Great Salt Pond. It's maintained by the Committee for the Great Salt Pond, which is one of the many organizations that is working hard to maintain, well, as they said in their early slogan, their effort is to keep the Great Salt Pond great. And there's information in the kiosk about their mission and what they're doing. Some of them have information about the areas. And this year I've noticed they've added a tide clock, which seems to lag a little, but not too bad. Pretty accurate. But we can walk down this boardwalk, which is now, we're going to an area that's really interesting. It's called Mosquito Beach and Boardwalk at low tide. So the entry point was up here at this end, and we've walked down, and I'm looking back at this wonderful boardwalk. And at this photo shows the beach at low tide. And you can see there's quite a distance between this sign and, well, you can't even see the edge of the pond. So one thing I want to point out about this area is similar to what I said in the last presentation about Billy Jones's being Harris Point, being Breezy Point. There are lots of names for the same areas on Block Island often, and they're pretty much indicative of an era. So most people of a certain era know of this area where the boardwalk is as the end of the lane, and that is referring to the end of the road, Indian Neck Road, that ended here. And it would take people by a horse-drawn trolley to the beach, and you would get off at the end of the lane and go across the street, or what was across the cartway, really, to the bathing beach on the east side of the island. After a while, when the road is long since gone and there's nobody around like me who even remembers it, only remembers people using the term the end of the lane. I grew up knowing this area as Innisfail, which is a reference to one of the houses in the area, a very distinctive house, which I'll be showing you shortly. And the whole area, to me, this particular cove, I always knew as Innisfail. If we were going to go to the beach or go clamming, I would have to tell my mother, you know, where I was going. And if I said Innisfail, she knew I was at this beach or this cove. And then in the 80s, I think, late 80s, when grant funds were gotten to build the boardwalk and do some work in this area, a town council member at the time, who was a great windsurfer, kept his windsurfing equipment here, always was annoyed by the great amount of mosquitoes, and he coined the name Mosquito Beach. And most people of the, I'll say, of the common era, in other words, now, do know the area as Mosquito Beach. Very few people refer to it as Innisfail, and even fewer as the end of the lane. Here's a looking, kind of standing where I was on the beach, looking northward at high tide a couple of days ago. And you notice not so much land between this sign and the edge of the water. And here's the end of the boardwalk. This is going to become very interesting over the next many years because of sea level rise, but that's really a different story than today. But you can see the rack line here of previous high tide. Sometimes the high tide is as high as this. The tides, as you may know, fluctuate quite a bit based on weather, but more importantly, based on the phase of the moon. At new and full moons, the tides are more dramatic. They're lower and they're higher. And that becomes very important in just a moment. And here we are looking in the other direction, southward, again, same sign, same short distance, high tide earlier this week. And this is where we're going to be going, around this headland, which is Indian Head Neck. But before we get there, I'm just going to have you look. Here we are back up on the boardwalk, looking on the left to the south over this green marsh. It's incredibly green right now. And to the north on the right, and you're seeing the same ditch that we saw earlier from this side, looking this way. Now we're seeing it here. And you can sense, you can see right here that there's a little bit of a barrier, a dune, if you will, and then it's low back here. And same thing on this side. That dune is very important for holding the ocean back. This is very low area. This will be inundated. They predict 7 feet of sea level rise, at least 7 feet in Rhode Island by the end of the century. When that happens, that means our normal low tide will be at the same height as Corneck Road, which is up here where the utility poles are. So right now, this holds it back, except for in a few areas. So here we are at one of the moon high tides. This was a couple of falls ago in September, I believe. The green, the Phragmites has all died back now. It's brown. I guess this one is actually later than September. But you can see it's completely inundated with tidal water. And here, same thing. This picture was taken in September. You can tell because it still has the seaside goldenrod right here, and the high tide bushes almost in bloom, but completely inundated. And there are openings that are back in here, and a couple of openings. And this was at the time that the boardwalk was built, this was dredged out just a little bit. It was hand dug, actually. I think there may have been a little bit of backhoe work from the beach, but not in the marsh itself. Just to make the openings, of which there are a couple here and a couple on the other side of the boardwalk, so that at extreme high tides, around the full and new moons, this water would become inundated and flooded with fresh salt water. In other words, not stale for salt water. But with it would come minnows and mummy chugs and all kinds of small fish. And then when the tide would recede, they would get trapped in this pool back here. And then for the next several tides, the tide would not get so dramatic, and thus these fish would be stuck back here. And they would become a natural detriment, I would say, to the mosquito larvae. So this is a biological remediation for mosquitoes. Instead of just draining the area, you use the propensity of the area to flood to make pools and leave little baby small bait fish there to really gorge themselves on mosquito larvae. And then at the next super high tide, the next time it was breached open, and in a couple of weeks, they would have a chance to leave, and fresh or new salt water would be introduced, and maybe a new crop of fish. And this is, as I say, it's called open water marsh management. And it's been, I think, fairly effective. And it's really wonderful to see and surprising to see when this area is fully flooded. I did not include, I have some wonderful photos, I didn't include them today, of where it's even higher than this, because those are usually in the winter tides, which tend to be more dramatic because of the proximity of the Earth to the moon, and because the weather can be much more severe and drive the water in. But for now, we'll go with a warm season, and we'll continue on our walk. So we're on the Mosquito Beach boardwalk. We've left that, and we're looking southwards towards Indian Head Neck. Before we get there, right up here, and many places along this whole section of walk that we're talking about, I just happened to choose this one. The slipper snail shells, and say that fast a few times, they tend to pile up in these like little banks of slipper snail shells, and they're quite beautiful in their, in their mass. A lot of times things are even more beautiful when there are many of them put together in all their different shapes and sizes and various stages of decomposition. So those are the slipper snail shells building up on the beach as we go along. But there are also quahogs in this area. I noticed that the quality of the purple in the quahog varies around the Great Salt Pond. And they're always, to me, they always seem the darkest in the area where we walked last week, between, say, the Black Island Club and Indian Head Neck. They're very deeply, intensely purple, and quite expansive, a lot of purple in here. So this, of course, this is the part of the shell that was used by Native Americans to make wampum, and wampum is a currency, a form of currency at the time. And it's interesting that at the time that the Dutch traders and the European traders were visiting the New World and starting to trade with the Native Americans, they became introduced to the idea of these great beads and belts made out of wampum, which were a form of currency. That is a early, late 1600s, right at the time that Linnaeus was developing the binomial naming system for the genus species system for naming biological specimens. And he named the quahog Mercenaria mercenaria. And mercenaria actually refers to doing something for money. Think of a mercenary. And I always think it's really amazing to think that the Native American population of the New World processing its wampum, its currency, influenced the Old World in its naming of the northern quahog. Some of the quahogs get a little old and beaten. I like this one because it was completely riddled with wormholes, and you can see the purple has really faded. But this must have been, again, a very strong purple because still there's quite a bit there. Given this is, I'm sure, a very, very old clam. It's riddled with holes and other things that have used the calcium in that shell. So to go a little further down the beach, I found this of interest. Maybe you will too. This boat out here is actually on a mooring, but it's not the traditional mooring that you might think of, where there's a mooring ball that goes to the bottom, and then the boat is tethered to the mooring ball, and then you have to figure out how to get out to it. This is an outhaul mooring. So this is set up so that the painter, the boat is attached to this line, and you can see that this line right here is a double line. You think of it as a clothesline, that's on a pulley so that you can stand in one place and get to the other end, get your clothes out to the other end. Well, that's exactly how an outhaul works. And in the center here is the second pulley set. The first pulley set is out here on the mooring ball. Here's this one, and this is the tail line. This line is actually attached here. This is quite a neat setup. Sometimes they're not quite so beautifully done. So you can't lose the end of the line that you need to pull on. But when you pull on this line, you're pulling, you're making this part of the rope smaller, and thus pulling the attached boat into shore. So obviously you can only do this with boats that do not have keels, but you can pull this out. And then the landward side of this outhaul rigging is up here, and it's tied off to a stake or something that's solid, so that that's what's holding all of the weight of this. So there are a few outhaul moorings around. This happens to be a particularly beautiful one, and many people ask me, well, what actually is an outhaul mooring? And I thought this was a great opportunity to show one and explain it. But I move on. So we're headed towards Indian Head Neck, that sort of headland. It's actually the Indian Head Neck itself is a elongated geologic deposit of material, generally referred to as a drumlin, and there are several drumlins around the island, which especially around the Great Salt Pond, which are an elongated sort of hill. And on this drumlin, there are some really beautiful historic buildings, and they really capture the mind when you go by. There's some others that have been built afterwards and are not quite so beautiful, but nonetheless, these are some beautiful ones. First, Innisfail, and this is where the name of the beach that I grew up knowing the area is named after this house, which was very distinctively there. Many of the houses that are around it now were not there in the 1960s and 70s. It was a building built in 1888 and is the older of the buildings on this headland. As you go along at that point, there's a very interesting building here. This is called a jerkin head gable. In other words, sometimes I've heard it referred to as a Dutch gambrel, but it's a gable end with its flattened top. So this particular one, it was in 1893, and I'll show you a different look of it here. This is the same building. It was built in, as I say, 1893. At the time, it was called Lakeside. So the house was called Lakeside, built on the side of the lake or the Great Salt Pond. In 1893, the opening to the channel was not yet built. So in many ways, it really was still a lake. And then a little bit further down the headland is the very classic Sullivan House. We know it as the Sullivan House, built in 1904. Again, that was originally called the Ninnicroft Lodge. And if you're familiar with these buildings, you know this has a wonderful, the bottom floor in here and underneath is made up of beach stones, very distinctive. So there's some really wonderful architecture, sort of the whimsy of the Victorian era. But we'll go back to nature, and right below the Ninnicroft Loft was a great egret feeding in the seaweed. You often see it. This is a little bit bigger than the snowy egret. Unlike the snowy egret, it has a yellow bill and black feet, so just the reverse. But equally as stately and beautiful. It has a slightly different feeding style, but both at the water's edge looking for little critters. Now, as we come along the headland, now the walk gets a little bit trickier. I have not done this in, I think it's been 3 years since I did this walk, or 2, I guess it was 2 years. And in that time period, they have done some work. This was the old retaining wall right below that building called the Ninnicroft Lodge. No, the Lakeside, right below Lakeside. And it was pretty old and crumbly, and they obviously got CRMC permission to reinforce the area, because this is a brand new sort of retaining wall built up right against the old one. And you can see how it's wedged in there, and I'm sure they poured the cement. I will say that this, sometimes when you're walking around, this is probably one of the hardest areas on the whole walk around the Great Salt Pond perimeter, because you have to really go at low tide. And you can wade out in the water, or you can walk along the upper rocks. And I did that this time. And it was actually easier than I had recalled, because the upper rocks aren't slippery. They don't usually have, they don't usually get wet, that wet, and therefore they've well dried out and they don't have black algae on them. And with this new retaining wall, it makes a very nice rail. You can kind of, use that to balance yourself as you go around the corner here. So I actually found this easier than some years. You can see other work that's being done to stabilize the bank is this netting, and hemp. There's probably like hemp grass-like material underneath the netting. And the idea is that plants will get, and maybe some of these were even planted, I don't think so though. Plants will get stuck in here, and the netting will give them a chance to hold the soil while the vegetation gets established. And then once the vegetation is established, it can help to hold the bank in place. So, so obviously there's relatively recent work been done along this whole retaining wall area. And here it ends. Obviously, only one homeowner was investing in this, because the next set of retaining wall is in rough shape. If you go a little bit further down the beach and turn around, you can look back and see again the end of it. Here's that beautiful house right on the precipice there, and you can understand why they want to hold the bank. But it continues and is quite old and crumbling, disintegrating retaining wall. There's metal in here to help give it strength, but the cement is falling away behind it and it's rusting out. And I'm not sure what the next property owner will do, but now they have a model for what can be done. So as we pass that area and go a little bit further down the beach, you start to notice an incredible treasure trove of rusted metal sculpture. And I call that sculpture in quotes. Lots of things. They're old pumps and parts of old tractors and probably cars, big chains. There's somewhere in here, I didn't see it on, I didn't take a photo, is a big hunk of rusted together chain. And, you know, this thing standing up on end. I actually find it sculptural and beautiful, and definitely is helping to hold the land there because it's not eroding away, it's rusting in place. And much of this headland was owned by the Ball family. I believe the last Ball family that I know who lived up was Gertrude Ball. She was a teacher at the Block Island School, and her husband Searles, who was a plumber and a great mechanic and could fix anything. He may have leave you with a real Rube Goldberg contraption of fixing, but it always worked. I believe, although it's not proven, that much of this debris was his that he just put over the bank to help stabilize it when he was done with his machinery. But it's quite interesting to look at and not doing any harm. We come to another really interesting glacial feature that's exposed in this part of the drumlin. You got still a little bit of I'll say Searles's sculpture, but this area is a set of what's called varves. Now, varves is a geologic term, and it refers to these thin deposited layers of silt and material that are put down during the year in a glacial pond. So this was a glacial lake, and like any lake, debris will settle to the bottom, and you know, when there's a lot of turbulence, it'll be rough, coarse debris, rough sand. And then in the winter, when it's frozen over, it's very still, and the finer material will then settle on it. So you get these sort of two-part layers, and each two-part layer refers to is a varve. And according to the work I read by Les Serkin in the Geology of Block Island, there are over 100 layers of varves. So this would represent 100 years of sort of sediment deposit in a glacial lake. And we're talking, you know, 20 to 15,000 years ago. The very fine material makes these perfect area for birds to dig in holes. These are all bank swallow nests. And if you've ever watched bank swallows, they're around the Great Salt Pond, but they're also around the outside of the island as well, on the ocean side, all around the island. We have the largest nesting population of bank swallows in Rhode Island because we have perfect habitat in these banks, quote unquote. And each one of those is fun to watch. I tried for a long time, and this is the best I could get of a bank swallow heading into its hole. A little blurry, but you get the idea. And if you stand there for any time, you can become completely mesmerized by watching the birds come in and go out, and come in and go out. And I always say, how do they know they're in the right house? Who knows? But a wonderful area, nesting area for the bank swallows among the geologic varves of the Great Salt Pond. So we're moving on. The beach is very stony, you know, not giant stones like on the ocean side, but like we saw early on by Andy's Way, they're rounded, they're smooth, but not as smooth as a beach cobble. And that's because they don't get as much action to smooth them out. But you do have these great sort of stony beach fronts, and they make for pretty great habitat. And also, again, the texture of the landscape is always interesting. So we continue on our walk. As we go along, we find areas where the Spartina has come down and is set up here. And there is fresh water in the area. You can tell because this is Phragmites. And Phragmites needs to have some fresh water. It can grow near salt water and very salty water, but it needs to have at least some source of fresh water. In the area, if you turn and look towards the water, I came across this little family of Canada geese, and they are pretty big. This one actually is a young, this one right here is a young, and this is probably also this year's young. This is one of the adults, but pretty sweet to see this little flotilla of Canada geese going along. And we keep moving along this edge to this next precipice, this next point. There's several of these sort of like little coves. You go and then you keep going. It scallops kind of its way towards our destination. But you notice that the vegetation here has come right down to the beach. And it's not that exposed bank that we had when we were looking at the varves. Along this beach, though, you can find all kinds of things. Near the water, you can find a green algae. Unlike codium, which we saw last week, this is a filamentous green algae. And I cannot tell you the genus species on this, but this is much more the texture of seaweed salad, very fine filaments of green algae or green seaweed. But a little bit higher up on the beach where the slipper snail shells are collecting, I noticed this really interesting green plant. It's very, again, equally green. I looked at it a little closer. It looks kind of spiky, and closely again. And although it looks spiky, it's not thorny at all. It's very fleshy, almost not quite like a succulent because it's a little bit more supple, but it's a plant known as tall sea blight. And it grows at the upper edge of the beach strand, where it can take some inundation, but for the most part, it is not inundated every day by salt water. Now we've gotten into that area where the vegetation is coming right down to the beach, and to me, it kind of looks like a little grotto. It's kind of what's in there. It's dark and inviting. But then I started looking at the tree and exactly what kind of tree is this? I started looking at the leaves and looking at the leaves. And I finally realized that it was locust, which is a pretty hardwood tree, but it does tend to break off in these big, long, tall limbs. But it takes a while. It's very hard wood for it to break down. So I imagine these trunks and branches, big trunks and branches of the locust will be there for quite a long time. And all of that becomes habitat and great opportunity for critters, birds, insects, all kinds of things like that to hide out amongst them. I will say I have not included any photos of insects today, but I saw many monarch butterflies on this walk. Also in that same area is bittersweet, Asiatic bittersweet, very leathery, coming down off of the ground. There must be groundwater seeping in to keep this lively, as well as the Phragmites here. It's just buried up. And nearby was another vine, Virginia creeper. Now, the Asiatic bittersweet is a non-native. It's an invasive plant, but the berries are eaten by birds, especially pheasant. And the Virginia creeper is a native vine, and its berries, which are just starting to form and will be getting dark blue, are also a very valuable source for all kinds of birds as the summer and fall come on. Found another plant growing sort of in the mix of this locust grotto, if you will, and this was a different mustard. So last week we saw the plant that's on the right, that is the field mustard. It's kind of low and light yellow, but this is a big, gangly, tall, very yellow mustard called black mustard, and you can see the intensity of the yellow is greater. The blossom heads are more compact. This again is the field mustard, and this is the black mustard. very yellow and beautiful. And I'm sure nutrients for somebody. Other things along the way, which I did not expect to find. Queen Anne's lace was sticking out of among the locusts. So again, there must be a good source of fresh water. And then a little further down, this hedged bindweed I thought was particularly beautiful against the background of the slipper snails, which are throughout this whole section that we're walking on this particular day of the slipper snail shells. And it is in the related to the morning glories, which I'm sure you can see. One of the distinguishing characteristics are these very long arrow-like leaves, not the big, wide, heart-shaped leaves of your more common morning glory. So hedge bindweed. And looking back a little bit, you can see here the dead branches that have fallen off of that locust. And just to look back, you see bayberry in the foreground. This is privet, and of course, Phragmites. So a nice little freshwater sort of seep is supporting all these plants along the way. Also, some beach roses, which we're used to seeing in their sort of yellow, their pink and their magenta color. But a little bit just beyond this part on the same beach was a bush that was all white. And this is just a variation. It is Rosa rugosa, beach rose, but an all white one. So you see those mixed in here and there. Now, as we go along, we're getting close to the end of Indian Head Neck as it narrows and comes out by the channel behind Black Island Maritime Institute or behind Deadeye Dicks, Smugglers, however you know the area. And the substrate is changing. It's getting more and more of these like peaty layers. It's very thick. Peat is just not undecomposed vegetation that over time breaks down and makes a solid sort of earth-like texture. And it's much denser, doesn't move like sand does. And so where it's sandy underneath, it gets eaten away, but the peat stays hanging out. And we'll see this a lot more on our next section next week, but it's starting to show up as we get closer to the edge of the end of this particular walk. But with the change, more sandy, more dense, more peaty, more clayey substrate, we start to see a different critter, and that would be the fiddler crab. There's quite a few in this area. Fiddler crabs, as you may know, and I'm sure later on in this series we'll have some other pictures, but they have the one big arm like a fiddle, and a little tiny small, that's the males, has a small pincher claw and a big claw, and that's for attracting females. The female will have two small pincher-like claws. One thing I love about these are their eyes. This is the eye right here, and here's another eye, and their eye is at the end of what is called a stalk, and they can move independently of each other. You can see this one's looking that way, and this one's looking that way. Actually, it's looking backwards, probably at me. And so they can cover a lot of ground with their stalk movable eyes. And if they get alarmed, they're going to look for a little hole and they're going to bury in. And here, this one is taking cover in its fiddler crab hole. Now, what's really interesting to me, which I never noticed before, and I'm going to have to do a little research after working on this presentation, is that here is the crab. It's gone sideways into its hole. Here is its elbow, if you will, of its big claw, just like this one. All right. And you can see its back is here, just like this one, and its legs are coming out as you see these. However, I realized that this claw has to be on the other side of the animal. So this would be a right-handed claw, and this would be a left-handed claw. Now, I know that to happen in lobsters, but I did not know that to happen in fiddler crabs. So by the time we get to another presentation, another part of this series where I'm really focusing on fiddler crabs, I hope to be able to say more about left and right-handed fiddler crabs. So we're pretty much near the end of the tip of Indian Head Neck. We've come to this little point, and if you look across the channel, you can see, well, this would be Dead-Eyed Dick's, and this is the building that used to be, this is the building that used to be Smugglers, and that Black Island Maritime now owns this property. And this is the boat launching ramp. And again, this is owned by the town because it was part of the town road. They actually came from here and came across here on a causeway and would have gone along the very stretch of land that we've just been traveling to the end of the lane, where you could then get off and go to the beach. A lot of activity at that boat launching ramp. It's great to see it so well used by people in their private boats. You can launch a good sized boat like that. I assume it's a Boston whaler with a big motor of some sort, right down to Corey Hines's kayak business and launching kayaks and kids and people doing, looks like he's got some kind of work and paraphernalia, and very busy area and a very cool asset for the, important asset the town has for the launching of boats. Access to the waterfront is really important in all island communities. And Black Island is particularly lucky in that we have a lot of access, but this is a particularly important one because it's easy to launch a boat that's on a trailer at this point. So if I turn around and look back, I would be looking back at Indian Head Neck along here. I'm looking at this building, which I grew up knowing as the McGregor House. It's also up on that drumlin. This building back here is the Sullivan House. And on our next stretch around the point, we'll be getting some really great looks at this building. That will be in the future. I've often been asked and have not too much information about the name Indian Head Neck. I will say that a neck as a piece of land like Corn Neck or Indian Neck is often refers to, like a peninsula of land. So you're going out to an area. So we're going out the neck if you're going down Corn Neck, or you're going out to Indian Head Neck. In Livermore's History of Black Island, there is a section that talks about finding archaeological bones in the bluff, in the bank, sort of where we were looking at those bank swallows, where they did find evidence of probably indigenous people buried, because the body was buried in a standing position. And so they said that they found that the head. I've also read in that same volume of Livermore's that the heads of some Native Americans were displayed there as some kind of warring revenge. Hard to know what's true. I'm sure some part of all of that is true, but thus the name Indian Head Neck. And in this case, the word neck and head are not really related. Neck refers to a sort of a geography. Indian Head refers to what was found on this piece of geography. With that, we'll turn around and look forward, go again almost out at very low tide at this particular time. Almost looks like you could walk across to the other side. What we're looking at the very tip of this point is at the hog pen and the docks over at Black Island Maritime Institute. And a couple of important boats over there, actually 3 working boats right at the end. We have, this is a town boat, the Marine Patrol boat. This is the Nature Conservancy's work boat, and it's docked right next to or perpendicular to the Marine Patrol boat at the moment. And this little green boat sticking out here, you can only see part of it, is the work boat for Catherine Puckett, who is an aquaculture and a seaweed grower, and we'll be meeting her in our next presentation. So 3 different types of working vessels, one for regulation, one for commerce, and one for science, all tucked in at the end of this dock here at the property now owned by the Black Island Maritime Institute. So we're nearing the end of this week's presentation, and as we did last week and will in the future, I just can't get enough of looking at all the different types of boats and fun things that you can do on boats and water conveyances that are loosely referred to as boats. Beautiful Peapod being rowed by the Harbor Church minister, Peter Preiser. I love this. So that's under oar power. This one is under dad power. This one is not under any power at all. It seems to be a stationary platform tethered off the end of a boat, a motorboat. And this is a sailing dinghy, but I love this Papa's Mermaids. This is actually the little sailing boat that goes with the houseboat of the woman who is of Catherine Puckett. And this is her children's boat. And I'm not sure if Papa is the grandfather or the father, but this is the boat for the two girls, Luna and Pearl, Papa's Mermaids. Nothing better than messing around in boats. So as I also mentioned last time, our Great Salt Pond stroll checklist will continue to grow. We added quite a few plants on this stroll, a few more animals, and I've introduced the category of minerals: the sandy shoreline, the rocky shoreline, the peaty substrate, and marshland. And just a way of having a little bit of fun and categorizing all the things that we're going to be seeing as we continue our stroll around the Great Salt Pond. And next week, into the hog pen and the various harbor or inner ponds, and we'll be going around the corner into some very muddy areas. So just always like to say, look out for whatever's out there in the pond floating, whether it's a flotation of Canada geese or Papa's Mermaids on a little sailing dinghy, or a dad propelled paddleboard. Always fun to see all the different critters that are using the new harbor for its way of life and its conveyances. And with that, I will say goodbye for today, and I'll switch over to unsharing my screen. Any questions you might have.
Thanks, Kim. That was great. And I love the growing checklist as we're going along. And I think George Davis put it in the chat that it was the grandfather, Catherine's
thank you.
dad, that made
I had a feeling that was the case, because
yeah,
he's
super sweet.
He's a pretty good builder too.
He's very handy. Yeah. I just have one quick question. The willet, I'm not a birder. And actually, we had seen one, on Trimis Pond, and I hadn't seen it before, or I didn't recognize it before. But now I go, oh, that's what that is. So you said they nest here, or?
They definitely nest in various places around the Great Salt Pond. I'm pretty sure there's a nest further in where we haven't yet gone on the stroll, where we'll be going in our next section. Okay. But at Andy's Way, there's several nests, and I wouldn't be surprised to think that there's one in the back of Trimis Pond. Yeah. And when they're in the air, you can really tell them when they're flying, because their wings have very broad black and white wing pattern, and they have a very loud pealing noise. Okay. If you hear a loud bird overhead, look up. It's either going to be a willet or oyster catcher. Yeah,
that's what I hear, those oyster catchers. Maybe I'm hearing the willet as well. So okay,
cool,
great. Alrighty, well, a couple of thanks in the chat. Anyone have any questions, or we're on to next week, part 3?
Part 3. Okay. And I see that Deandra Verbest, our Great Salt Pond scientist, is on the call. So if she has anything to add or corrections to make, I'm happy to be corrected.
I think you're doing an awesome job. I'm learning a lot too, so thank you so much for all the content.
Yeah, I love all of it too, just like all the history as well, and the naming of the buildings and weaved in with everything, and it's great, Kim. Love it. And also Andrew is also on the call, Andrew Gelsamini, and he is our summer marine assistant as well on the pond. So great, awesome.
All right, and I hope to be getting some quotes from the various other organizations that are doing all this great work, like from the Great Salt Pond Committee, George Davis particularly, and his connections to what's happening when we get around to Andy's Way from the Shellfish Commission point of view, because a lot of work's being done by the town and by other nonprofits to keep the Great Salt Pond great.
Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
So thanks for joining us again, Sally. You're a good regular.
Oh, I'm here.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, with that, I think we'll see you all next week, I hope.
Okay.
All righty,
Thanks.
thanks
Great,
everyone.
Thank you.
You.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Keep cool.
Thank you.